You must understand the following. In order to master a field, you must love the subject and feel a profound connection to it. Your interest must transcend the field itself and border on the religious. For Einstein, it was not physics but a fascination with invisible forces that governed the universe. For Bergman, it was not film but the sensation of creating and animating life. For Coltrane, it was not music but giving voice to powerful emotions. These childhood attractions are hard to put into words and are more like sensations, that of a deep wonder, sensual pleasure, power, and heightened awareness. The importance of recognizing these pre-verbal inclinations is that they are clear indications of an attraction that is not infected by the desires of other people. They are not something embedded in you by your parents, which come with a more superficial connection, something more verbal and conscious. Coming instead from somewhere deeper, they can only be your own reflections of your unique chemistry. As you become more sophisticated, you often lose touch with these signals from your primal core. They can be buried beneath all of the other subjects you have studied. Your power and future can depend on reconnecting with this core and returning to your origins. You must dig for signs of such inclinations in your earliest years. Look for its traces in visceral reactions to something simple, a desire to repeat an activity that you never tired of, a subject that stimulated an unusual degree of curiosity, feelings of power attached to a particular action. It is already there within you. You have nothing to create. You merely need to dig and refine what has been buried inside of you all along. If you reconnect with this core at any age, some element of that primitive attraction will spark back to life, indicating a path that can ultimately become your life's task. Occupy the perfect niche, the Darwinian strategy. As a child growing up in Madras, India, in the late 1950s, V.S. Ramachandran knew he was different. He was not interested in sports or other usual pursuits of boys his age. He loved to read about science. In his loneliness, he would often wander along the beach, and soon he became fascinated by the incredible variety of seashells that washed up on the shore. He began to collect them and study the subject in detail. It gave him a feeling of power. Here was a field he had all to himself. Nobody in school could ever know as much as he did about shells. Soon he was drawn to the strangest varieties of seashells, such as Xenophora, an organism that collects discarded shells and uses them for camouflage. In a way, he was like Xenophora, an anomaly. In nature, these anomalies often serve a larger evolutionary purpose. They can lead to the occupation of new ecological niches, offering a great chance of survival. Could Ramachandran say the same about his own strangeness? Over the years, he transferred this boyhood interest into other subjects, human anatomical abnormalities, peculiar phenomena in chemistry, and so on. His father, fearing that the young man would end up in some esoteric field of research, convinced him to enroll in medical school. There he would be exposed to all sides of science and he would come out of it with practical skill. Ramachandra complied. Although the studies in medical school interested him, after a while he grew restless. He disliked all of the rote learning. He wanted to experiment and discover, not memorize. He began to read all kinds of science journals and books that were not on the reading list. One such book was Eye and Brain by the visual neuroscientist Richard Gregory. What particularly intrigued him were experiments on optical illusions and blind spots, anomalies in the visual system that could explain something about how the brain itself functioned. Stimulated by this book, he conducted his own experiments, the results of which he managed to get published in a prestigious journal, which in turn led to an invitation to study visual neuroscience in the graduate department at Cambridge University. Excited by this chance to pursue something more suited to his interests, Ramachandran accepted the invitation. After a few months at Cambridge, however, he realized that he did not fit in this environment. In his boyhood dreams, science was a great romantic adventure, an almost religious like quest for the truth. But at Cambridge, for the students and faculty, it seemed to be more like a job. You put in your hours, you contributed some small piece to statistical analysis, and that was that. He soldiered on, finding his own interest within the department, and completed his degree. A few years later, he was hired as an assistant professor in visual psychology at the University of California at San Diego. As had happened so many times before, after a few years his mind began to drift to yet another subject, this time to the study of the brain itself. He became intrigued by the phenomena of phantom limbs, people who have had an arm or leg amputated and yet still feel a paralyzing pain in the missing limb. He proceeded to conduct experiments on phantom limb subjects. These experiments led to some exciting discoveries about the brain itself as well as a novel way to relieve such patients of their pain. Suddenly, the feeling of not fitting in, of restlessness, was gone. Studying anomalous neurological disorders would be the subject to which he could devote the rest of his life. It opened up questions that fascinated him about the evolution of consciousness, the origin of language, and so on. It was as if he had come to full circle to the days of collecting the rarest form of seashells. This was a niche he had all to himself, one he could command for years to come that corresponded to his deepest inclinations and would serve best the cause of scientific advancement. B. For Yoki Matsuoka, childhood was a period of confusion and blur. Growing up in Japan in the 1970s, everything seemed laid out for her in advance. The school system would funnel her into a field that was appropriate for girls, and possibilities were rather narrow. Her parents, believing in the importance of sports in her development, pushed her into competitive swimming at a very early age. They had also had her take up the piano. For other children in Japan, it may have been very comforting to take their lives directed in such fashion, but for Yuki, it was painful. She was interested in all kinds of subjects, particularly math and science. She liked sports but not swimming. She had no idea what she wanted to become or how she could possibly fit into such a regimented world. At the age of 11, she finally asserted herself. She had had enough of swimming and wanted to take up tennis. Her parents agreed her wishes. Being intensely competitive, she had great dreams for herself as a tennis player, but she was starting out in sport rather late in her life. To make up for lost time, she would have to undergo an almost impossibly rigorous practice schedule. She traveled outside Tokyo for training and so would do her homework on the ride back at night. Often having to stand up in the crowded car, she would crack open her math and physics books and work out the equations. She loved solving puzzles, and in doing this homework, her mind would become so completely absorbed in the problems that she was barely aware of the time passing. In a strange way, it was similar to sensation she felt on the tennis court, a deep focus where nothing could distract her. In the few free moments on the train, Yoki would think about her future. Science and sports were the two great interests in her life. In them, she could express all of the different sides of her character, her love of competing, working with her hands, moving gracefully, analyzing and solving problems. In Japan, you had to choose a career that was generally quite specialized. Whatever she chose would require sacrificing her other interests, would depress her to no end. One day she daydreamed about inventing a robot that could play tennis with her. Inventing and playing against such a robot would satisfy all of the different sides of her character, but it was only a dream. Although she had risen through the ranks to become one of the top tennis prospects in Japan, she quickly realized that this was not to be her future. In practice, no one could beat her, but in competition, she would often freeze up, overthink the situation, and lose to inferior players. She also suffered some debilitating injuries. She would have to focus on academics and not on sports. After attending a tennis academy in Florida, she convinced her parents to let her stay in States and apply to the University of California at Berkeley. At Berkeley, she could not decide on a major. Nothing seemed to quite fit with her wide ranging interests. For lack of anything better, she settled on electrical engineering. One day, she confided to a professor in her department about her youthful dream to build a robot to play tennis with her. Much to her surprise, the professor did not laugh but instead invited her to join his graduate lab for robotics. Her work there showed so much promise that she was later admitted to graduate school at MIT where she joined the artificial intelligence lab of robotics pioneer Rodney Brooks. They were developing a robot with artificial intelligence, and Matsuoka volunteered to design the hand and arms. Even since she was a child, she had pondered her own hands while she was playing tennis or the piano or while scribbling out math equations. The human hand was a miracle of design. Although this was not exactly sports, she would be working with her hands to construct the hand. Finding at last something that suited a larger range of her interests, she worked night and day on building a new kind of robotic limb, one that possessed as much as possible the delicate grasping power of human hand. Her design dazzled Brooks. It was years ahead of anything anyone had ever developed. Feeling that there was a critical lack in her knowledge, she decided to gain an additional degree in neuroscience. If she could better understand the connection between the hand and the brain, she could design a prosthetic limb that would feel and respond like a human hand. She continued this process, adding new fields of science to her resume, culminating in the creation of a completely new field, one that she would dub neurobotics, the design of robots that possessed simulated versions of human neurology, bringing them closer to life itself. Forging this field would bring her great success in science and put her in the ultimate position of power, the ability to freely combine all of her interests.